So creating compelling stories. The question that we started with from the NICM side of things and kind of the Navigator side of things was, what is an architectural, when you look at these projects as architectural pieces, and that's what we are trying to bring as navigators. What is an architectural narrative? What does it mean? What does it include? What are some of the elements? And at the end of the day, is it just a story, or is it actually a design tool? So an architectural narrative will include elements like events, characters or users, messages, so the values of the piece and of the project, histories in terms of the cultural context, and history of an organization even, or histories of an individual, as well as desires. So what I have here on the right-hand side is Santiago Calatrava's, one of his pieces, which is the Brookfield place in Toronto. And I have a little excerpt from, sort of not his architectural narrative, but a little bit of his architectural philosophy. And that's to basically see his designs as innovative. So things that are not normal or not following the convention. And that it has to arise through a bit of a cultural context. So each piece having an understanding of its space, conveying sensibility through design. So recognizing that there are certain forms and ideas culturally that exist in order to create kind of these truly inspiring structures. Now, the Brookfield place, the idea is, and as it's written here, it's a place that acts as a culmination of built form, meant to be forms, and community. So the goal in this project was to not just build something that would cover from the weather or keep people warm, but actually actively draw people in and form community within the space, strictly due to what would otherwise just be a structural element. And as you can see, it's quite an enticing spacing here. It does draw you in, and it draws from some of these elements in nature to create something that is delightful, which is the goal of architecture. So, what is an architectural narrative at a glance? It is creating a project whose purpose is clearly known. Intuitively. So looking at this, maybe you don't necessarily know the words to put into this. It doesn't have to look exactly like a duck to be a duck. But you start to get the understanding of lightness. You start to get the understanding of something novel, something different and innovative. And you start to get an experience that makes you, that draws you in and that gets you to engage with the space. And that was kind of the idea of this, which is ultimately a bit of an atrium kind of between buildings. So architectural narratives, they do serve a variety of different functions. They're not just about coming up with something after the fact that is a bit of an explanation of the piece. They're really about creating and summarizing an ethos and a spirit in order to move forward with a project and serve some functions. So one of those functions is coming up with a narrative that gets everyone on the same page. This idea that you come up with a spirit of a piece, and if it is, clearly, as on the last slide, clearly known, the purpose is clearly known, then it gets people on the same page and can help make sure that ideas, decisions, and overcoming of constraints and compromises is done so in a way that is conducive to the overall spirit of the piece. It can act as a motivator, as you can imagine. Coming up with a story that is exciting is something that can draw more people to the project, while not diminishing or perhaps corrupting the values of the client and of your project. It acts as a bit of a tool of reminding us where we're going. And some of this may sound a bit similar to what we were talking about in the phase one, when we're talking about project charters, understanding what are your objectives, what's your conceptual foundation? Conceptual foundation is important, not just in going forward with some type of initiative, but also with the projects, these built forms, which we're all seeking in different ways. And that foundation is important because it reminds us where we started and where we are going. It's maybe to Sophie, it's very easy to, once you start getting into building, realize that there are a lot of decisions that have to be made. But as soon as you start making those decisions, if one is not careful, then little bits of the soul and the essence of the piece can get lost along the way. And that's something that you want to protect with or protect from, especially when we're coming up with fairly significant and complex projects, things that have spaces to take care of families, of kids, of different target audiences, as well as buildings that exist within the community that you're trying to, not just take from, but actually contribute to and grow and foster. So an architectural narrative, it does help remind everyone where you're going, and it can do so quickly. And it works as a unifying actor to create, this is a little flowery, but aesthetic harmony throughout the building. It's just to say that your really compelling, beautiful pieces are not only aesthetic, there are programmatic functions, there are essences of the piece that work together in harmony. And what that does is creates a way for a project to deal with kind of tiny details as well as big details. And when I say kind of details, what I mean is basically solutions to solve a specific problem. It could be as simple as what type of flooring you're going to have. It could be as large as, is this building going to be accessible? Are there going to be ramps to get into it? And all of this works together when you start to go through that design process. As you can all tell, we're very early on in all of these projects. We've made great progress, but there is an exponential amount of information that starts to get thrown around as we go forward. These projects can very quickly take a life of their own. So some of this isn't about creating a story just for marketing. It's really about creating a story of the piece, because the project in itself, the development in and of itself, should have a bit of a spirit, and a spirit helps with these various elements. So the piece that you see over here, use of the architectural narrative. So when you have one of those strong narratives, it does add a lot of interest. It adds a spirit, which can serve benefits not just for you operationally, or like the design magazines would want to write about. It can serve a really powerful function. So thinking of a local example, maybe even like one that comes to mind for me is the Halifax Central Library, just that it is a new and very much commended piece of architecture. And it's been readily accepted by the community. Many people go there, many people enjoy that space. And it has kind of a spirit to it. It's different on the inside than it is on the outside. It's a novel, kind of an innovative way to see a library and see a community space. And it has succeeded in having that architectural narrative clearly conveyed, not just in the outer form, which is meant to look like it resemble a pile of books that are sort of stacked in tilted ways. It creates kind of this compelling connection with the community as a whole. So the piece that you see on the right-hand side here is Aero Surinen. And this is the TWA Flight Center in New York, which is actually a pretty old project. It's a 1962 piece, to juxtapose the library. But the architectural narrative of this piece was to capture the sensation of flight in all aspects of the building. So to have this be a flight center that feels like flight, it's fluid and open on the inside. It has this kind of wing-like concrete shelf. I mean, you look at this and you're like, yep, that looks like it's ready to take off. And it sort of makes you want to go. It sort of makes me, but I'm a nerd, want to go inside and experience something like this. It's also quite monumental in its scaling, which scale does matter in order to be a bit more of a monument and a statement for aviation. And this is just looking at the inside. You see it has this kind of like a curved surface. Again, this is 60s concrete as you do, but the space inside, you can really start to capture these little details. The benches and seats along the right-hand side over here, even the types of railing, and kind of this flowing nature of the mezzanine here. And I'm not trying to get too poetic about this. I'm just trying to spark a bit of joy in what can otherwise be a pretty grueling process of looking for funders and figuring out if you can get board approval and, you know, if the city will change its bylaws. There's a lot of delight that can come from this process, and the more delight you can glean from it, the better the result you can get. It can help strengthen the project. So creating compelling stories and using those stories, drawing from those messages, values within your organization, and really trying to root yourself in what you do well. This is a difficult concept to grasp, but I'll try to clarify it just a little bit. The idea is that if you as an organization are really sound in what it is you do and why it is you do it, the decisions that you make along the way will start to reflect your narrative, kind of no matter what. If you're about supporting your clients through creating new opportunities for them in, you know, like I just use Lake City Works as an example, you know, getting them into a space where they can contribute, where they can work, where they can see those values, participate with others, and have that kind of a little bit enterprisorial, enterprise-like participation within a community. Then the other decisions that you make about how open your dining room should be, or what your development programs should include, those will all resonate from your values, right? If you just start from a place where you know and you're quite convinced you know what it is you're doing, then those decisions will get made, because no decision within this whole design process is nonpartisan. There's always kind of a political side to it. There's always a past history that you're bringing to it. There's always a characteristic from your experiences that is going to be represented in the decisions that you make. You know, how I use the example, how open is your kitchen, but other things like what sort of spaces do you want to provide in the affordable housing project? And if you can't provide them, then what will you do to provide them? You know, like that's sort of that's where these compromises come in. So the Gensler Research Institute, it's this wonderful little excerpt here, which is talking about the 4 key storytelling items, which are characters, image, backstory, backstory and theme. And you see, you know, narrative approach can help capture deep-rooted sentiments about a project, clarifying and reinforcing the project's goals, and provide an overall design intent that guides the entire project team. It's not that you're saying, I need to go back and check what my narrative-driven design is all about and ask, oh, does this go in line with my narrative-based design? It's kind of this idea that so long as you have that in the back of your mind, those decisions that you make are going to naturally protect those values. So just blowing up some of this. So 4 key components to of this storytelling. Characters. So who is this going to engage with? Who is experiencing it and how are they experiencing it? Be it its interior or its exterior. So how does it participate in the community as a building? Or do people walk by and go, oh, because that's not great. You don't want that. It's not good for your organization any more than it's good for the people walking down the street. If it evokes a mood, if it kind of creates an emotion. So I showed you that Calatrava piece where, you know, it's really kind of just gives you a bit of delight. And even the TWA, flight center, kind of having this idea of a monument to flight. So how does your project, as you go forward, you know, does it have any of those little things that kind of spark that joy? The backstory is going to be its accumulated history. So the property on which you're developing, has this kind of, have there been stories told on this site? Has it been part of big decisions? Has it seen a city change? Is it actively participating in the community and it's going to continue to do so? Has it seen lives improved and lives changed? Those sorts of questions, those actually do sort of matter. It doesn't need to be like the placard on the restaurant that says, you know, Elvis Presley once, you know, brought his dog and his dog, you know, used the washroom outside the restaurant, and it was a memorable moment. You know, it's not necessarily kind of that history. It doesn't have to be as rigid as that. But the idea of, let's go back to the Halifax Central Library, for instance, because clearly I don't get out much. The living room up on the top, the purpose of that living room was to be a focal point, and even that overhang was to gesture directly to Citadel Hill. That was one of the characters of that space. It was meant to say, Halifax knows that Citadel Hill is an important and a long-standing characteristic of the city, and baked into Citadel Hill are a whole bunch of different histories and narratives. So learn about them in the library and enjoy them in the library. You know, let's have this architecture actually focus you towards this element. It's literally pointing right to it, right? So that you can be more subtle than that, or you can be pretty obvious. And then the theme. So that's that universal belief, what it is that you're trying to convey in your design. Maybe it's very subtle. Maybe it's just that for your structural elements, you wanted to go with a small scale kind of a wooden structure, because you believe that the touching of wood, the being around a wooden structure, this is going to sound really flowery, but being around your wooden beams and your columns, when you touch them, it connects you to a natural environment compared to a potentially man-made one using steel or concrete. Let's say as an example. I'm just trying to paint the picture here of what this theme can involve. So characters, image, backstory, and theme are things that we can kind of think about as we start to get further into these projects. And thankfully, we have these wonderful group charters that everyone's kind of been working through. So some of these have turned into, really just a description of what the goal is for this initiative. Maybe it's just looking at feasibility, and this doesn't have that flowery language in it or kind of that soul of the piece. But maybe it does. Maybe this is about, maybe within there are some baked in values, reestablishing community during demographic change, helping a specific target audience or target, I say target audience because that's later in the presentation, but helping a particular demographic and type of people, representing certain histories. Some of those elements will be baked in there. And if they aren't, maybe this is a little bit of a cue to go and say, hey, you know what? We know that community matters a lot. We want to make sure that there is a gesture captured in this project that really speaks to community. We don't want to lose that, for instance. Maybe it's as simple as really low-hanging fruit. Maybe it's as simple as just giving a wider sidewalk or like a plaza in the front, or maybe it's as dramatic as saying, with the front door, we want it to feel like it doesn't even exist, so people can just walk right in. It's like they're still in the community even when they're inside the building. These are different architectural ways that you can start to express this stuff. To maybe to Lindsay, I'm thinking of the childcare space and that outdoor space. Maybe it's about if the building isn't just rectilinear, if it kind of curves in a little bit, maybe it's almost like trying to keep those kids cherished and protected, and actually visible and participating with more perimeter. Like maybe that's an element here. So there are a lot of ways that this can be conveyed in a kind of a lovely sense. It's just a matter of keeping them in mind as we go. Okay, so let's go to something completely different. There are examples within the housing realm that I would say fail to tell a story particularly well or clearly. So there are risks that can cause this. So economic constraints, basically saying we have no money, we've got to build something, so we've got to go with the cheapest option, or we have to build it right now. It's got to go. There can be compromises that arise due to different values within the organizations that cause conflict, and maybe that's not reflected very well. There can be constraints, economic constraints or political constraints in terms of, I'm thinking of Kathy with Christchurch. The zoning is a constraint, that's realized. So how do we kind of go about mitigating that risk? What's our strategy for that? So what I have here is McMansion Hell, one of the images from this. Has anyone, maybe just a raise of hands if they've heard of McMansions before? So this is Kate Wagner. She's the creator of the blog, and I just want to play a little excerpt from her because I think that this will capture the sentiment a little bit, and the fact that, from an architectural side of things, and you as potential clients for an architect, for like a principal designer, there are ways that you can kind of protect the spirit of your piece that, if not clarified, can go a little off the rails and get a little silly. So I'm just going to pull that up, just one sec. So can you all see my screen? And thumbs up if you can hear this.
There's a certain type of house that people love to hate. They're called McMansions.
That is like so really, it's just like perfect McMansion hell material. God, these are all really stupid though.
Kate Wagner runs the architectural blog McMansion Hell. She's on a mission to explain to the world what's so uniquely awful about these buildings.
What separates a McMansion from a normal house is 99% of the times its size. It's a house that's usually over 3,000 square feet, which is 500 square feet above the highest national average. The designs are sloppy. They don't take into account things like scale and balance and the basic rules of architecture.
Most McMansions are amalgamations of different architectural schools, borrowing a gable from here, a window shape from there, with no rhyme or reason. Some even co-opt an entire regional style and transplant it, like placing a southwestern-style tile roof on an East Coast home.
All of those things sort of combined together form this thing that's really easy to dislike because it's pretentious.
McMansions are generally built by developers in suburban housing developments. These homes are designed from the inside out to satisfy certain luxury requirements that help it meet its hefty price tag, like cathedral ceilings in a bathroom. The first design casualty is usually the home's roofline.
The nub is what happens when roofers or designers are lazy and, instead of doing the logical thing, which is to square out a roof or to have like a nice hipped roof or a nice gable, they decided instead to just combine the two into this hunch that kind of sits on the top of a house and makes really no architectural sense. There are degrees of nubbiness. I think on a scale of 1 to 10, I think this house is maybe a 7 on the nub scale. I've seen some really heinous nubs in my life.
Other hallmarks of the McMansion include mismatched windows, turrets, a 2-story entryway that Kate likes to call the lawyer foyer, and columns. Lots and lots of columns.
Here we have some columns that are carry significant visual weight, right? And they're holding up nothing but a slab of foam. It's foam. The McMansion and a lot of the little attributes to it, like the big columns and the huge 2-story entryway, are a direct metaphor for a bank. You think about how a bank looks, you have this stately, this is where the money is kept. And so it's this is where my money is. this is my money. None of the columns are actually load bearing. It's all decorative. A lot of them are hollow. A lot of them are literally just pasted on.
There have always been really large houses in the United States, but historically the people who owned them were wealthy, like really wealthy. Think Roosevelts and Rockefellers. McMansions first began to appear in the United States in the 1970s as people fled city centers for the suburbs. The 90s saw a McMansion boom as the availability of cheap oil allowed for people to heat massive homes and drive everywhere. Mortgage reforms under the Clinton administration made McMansions accessible to even more buyers than ever before. But Kate doesn't lay the blame solely with cheap energy and policy changes.
You have to think also of popular media at the time, like MTV Cribs, all of this focus on other people's money. And people translated this idea of like, I have a lot into I have a big house.
Welcome, 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 MTV.
I was always an HGTV kid. Like, I've been fascinated with houses my whole life. Probably a little too much. HGTV started mostly as like an arts and crafts kind of channel. Like things like shabby chic, like how to like upcycle a dresser, how to make cute like outfits for your cats. That all changed in 1999 when House Hunters premiered. That took off. This was part of the reality TV craze of the 2000s.
So I'm gonna do something kind of radical. I'm gonna go buy a house.
And if you look at like those old episodes of HGTV, you can see the sort of economic bubble even in its prime form as a primary source.
I've done all my numbers and I know I'll be fine as long as I'm responsible. And I am responsible, so it'll go very well.
When we look back on these things, it's like, yes, we were documenting them the whole time, but not from the angle that we thought we were.
The legacy of the McMansion may be as the poster child of the housing bubble in 2008, but trends say McMansions aren't going away anytime soon. They offer a high return on investment for developers, and even though it might be maddening to readers of McMansion Hill, people are buying them.
My favorite emails to get are people who are realtors, who are like, I want to say these things so much it tears my hair out. This is like giving me like a reason to continue on. But it turns out like everyone hates McMansions. And I think that giving people the freedom to be like, I actually hate that, and then giving them the vocabulary and the sort of knowledge to say, I hate that, and I know why I hate that. If you give people the power to express why they don't like something, then it creates a discussion. And I had no idea so many people hated these houses as much as I hate them. And now everyone has to suffer alongside of me because now they will forever notice that the shutters won't actually close over the window.
So that I thought would be a little bit of a funny thing to add in here. Now, obviously, there's a lot of subjectivity, and I have to be very careful myself because at the end of the day, these are people's homes, and homes are an important element. But it is to say that there are some design-related conventions and ways that you can create an experience for your piece, for your projects, that hopefully don't inspire this kind of thing, or a bit more like some of the other projects we were looking at. Now, to go forward and actually think about something in particular. So creating your architectural narratives, we have, yes. There are some ways that they can be outlined. And ultimately, you can safeguard some of the values that you have if maybe you can answer some of these questions as you go forward. And it's not necessarily, within your organization that people are going to be challenging this. It's going to be cost, it's going to be approval, it's going to be zoning, it's going to be constraints about size and envelope, and really seemingly kind of boring things at the end of the day that you just want to make sure are not kind of whittling away that narrative. So focusing on your critical location. I mean, we're all focused in Dartmouth North, generally speaking, and it does have a character. It has a history. And it has something that folks do want to develop and explore. And I mean, this was quite clear in the answers that you've all given for those roundtable check-ins. What do you think of when you think of a future Dartmouth North, or what do you want to see, or what sort of potentials are there? It's clearly a very exciting area. And it has a character, it has a history, and it has a community that you're all tapped into. So that's actually quite easy for you and a little bit harder for maybe other people who would come in and seek developing in that area who don't understand the community. Keeping people at the center, again, not hard for community organizations. In fact, it's kind of your strong suit. So my and kind of Benji's recommendation is to push that. Creating a journey for others and not just proposing a destination. So the idea that people can join in and kind of be part of something, something bigger moving forward, is quite an exciting way to rally support, which is also it's a benefit for a community organization to be able to create those partnerships by creating something exciting and proposing something that's exciting. Know when you're not an expert. I live that, but the situation is that there are things that you will all know very well that you can and should be sharing with, when you go down the path of political contacts, filling out permits, seeking project managers, seeking prime consultants, your architects, your people who are going to keep the project going, funders and developing partners. There are things that they won't know that you absolutely know. There are also things that they know that you probably don't. So being able to bounce back and forth and not necessarily push into areas where you may not have that expertise is just a way to outline those narratives. This was captured a little bit in the project charters, where it outlines what is an assumption and it outlines what are some constraints as well. Size matters, so taking scale into account, what's within your capacities, but what is within your capacities in such a way as it helps you serve your mandate, right? So if it's participating with community, if it's providing housing for a certain demographic, if it's creating a certain product, there are certain points where if you stretch yourself too far, then it's going to run a risk because you may find yourself in a position where you need to take on those partnerships where it's not going to be as even. And that is one of the priorities that you've all kind of outlined, which is how do you maintain control? So knowing what is an appropriate scale is quite important. And from an architectural point of view, it also matters, right? Linda, I know that you've been going through space summaries, you've done that exercise. And when you start listing all these different things, everything from your units, which is fine, to your mechanical spaces, to your washrooms, to your bike parking, to your egress corridors, there's a lot of stuff involved. So it's not always a case of going bigger or not going at all. It's sometimes a matter of, like the Goldilocks zone, trying to pick that right size. That's a really important element. Now, in terms of relating those elements in tiny details, thinking about your project and what sort of really, really subtle little things continue to play an important role as you go forward can really help bring a project together. Maybe I'll give it like an example would just be you're making an accessible, let's say your goal is to create accessible affordable housing within North Dartmouth. Well, then if that's the case, making sure that your whatever flooring you're even envisioning at the start, whatever way that your building is laid out, that it avoids thresholds so that you don't have these bumps kind of when you jump into one room versus another. That's a tiny little detail, but it absolutely plays to the piece. So maybe the strategy is that the whole space is going to be a bit more open than you expected. Maybe you can't have intensive privacy and also accessibility. Maybe there's a conflict there, and if so, how are you going to reflect that to protect your values? If all the flooring, let's say, is going to be the same on this floor, why is it all the same? Well, because we are standing by making this the easiest, nicest spot for those who are within a wheelchair or have difficulty with their locomotion to navigate, right? Those little details, it all kind of builds up. Being realistic about your constraints, Sometimes there will be constraints, and if you try too hard to push through them, then it's going to be a challenge. And protecting what has emotion. So what's that element of your project that you're saying, this isn't just about getting a certain number of units. This is about making these the kind of units that are actually doing or are changing lives, in that sense. So to that last point, I actually have a little bit of some slides from the Brigadoon project, which Brigadoon, for those of you who don't know, is a camp for those living with chronic illness on Aylesford Lake. And what you see here is, this is that phase 2 really early model that we had made, but this was actually just a very early sketch that was created using a simplified model. And what I want to show you is that this is it under construction. And you see this comparison, I mean, keeping that ethos and those ideas alive all the way to actual construction, even from a sketch, can be a really powerful thing. So this image was taken on Saturday, actually, and they had their phase 2 grand opening. So I want to show you something just quickly, if I can pull it up. So. So there's the ringing of the bell on Saturday for the grand opening, and the use of the bell was a really important element. The bell itself, actually, I sort of helped out with that. It was we were looking everywhere to get one. At the end of the day, we found a foundry that could make a bell, and one of the I don't think he's the executive director. He may be. Reached out to this foundry and said, hey, this is the story, this is what we're doing here. And the guy said, hey, well, we can't make you a bell, but I actually have a bell in my backyard and I live in this area in Ontario. The guy said, wait a second, my brother and I grew up in that area. That's such odds. Did you go to this school? They didn't know each other, but they lived very close to each other. And he ended up, the executive director, driving over and picking up this bell just from the guy in his backyard, just to have that kind of story. And it's just an old train bell from, I think it's campanologist, is somebody who studies bells. But the young boy that you see there is actually the son of kind of the initial founder of the Brigadoon camp, somebody who wanted to just build a camp for those living with chronic illness because he was one of those people himself. This a little excerpt here. So, to give children and youth a special place, a magical place where they could go and be labeled not by their illness, but by how loud they could sing, the gooeyest s'mores that they could possibly make, their silliest face, and his favorite, the craziest of hats. So today Brigadoon Village is it's quite a successful camp with over 30 camp programs. And the largest pediatric medical camp facility in Canada. So this is about creating compelling stories, right? This is an incredibly compelling story that's been captured and kind of gained people along the way. But let's look at affordable housing, because last thing that we saw about affordable housing, and then I can close this out. Last thing that we saw was, tongue in cheek, sure, but a little on the pompous side. Maybe there are a bit some other ways that we can look at what affordable housing can be, and a particular creative, compelling story that I know about affordable housing. So let's just see if I can pull this up. And I'm not going to play the whole thing. I'm just going to play the start. But this is Alejandro Aravena, who is the architect behind Half a House, which great little name. And he's just going to kind of speak to that element in that project.
If there's any power in design, that's the power of synthesis. The more complex the problem, the more the need for simplicity. So allow me to share 3 cases where we tried to apply design's power of synthesis. Let's start with the global challenge of urbanization. It's a fact that people is moving towards cities, and even if counterintuitive, it's good news. Evidence shows that people is better off in cities. But there's a problem that I would call the 3S menace. The scale, speed, and scarcity of means with which we will have to respond to this phenomenon has no precedence in history. For you to have an idea, out of the 3 billion people living in cities today, 1 billion is under the line of poverty. By 2030, out of the 5 billion people that will be living in cities, 2 billion are going to be under the line of poverty. That means that we will have to build a 1 million people city per week with $10,000 per family during the next 15 years. A 1 million people city per week with $10,000 per family. If we don't solve this equation, it is not that people will stop coming to cities. They will come anyhow, but they will live in slums, favelas, and informal settlements. So what to do? Well, an answer may come from favelas and slums themselves. A clue could be in this question we were asked 10 years ago. We were asked to accommodate 100 families that had been occupying illegally half an hectare in the center of the city of Iquique in the north of Chile, using a $10,000 subsidy with which we had to buy the land, provide the infrastructure, and build the houses that in the best of the cases would be of around 40 square meters. And by the way, they said, the cost of the land, because it's in the center of the city, is 3 times more than what social housing can normally afford. Due to the difficulty of the question, we decided to include the families in the process of understanding the constraints. And we started a participatory design process and testing what was available there in the market. Detached houses, 30 families could be accommodated. Row houses, 60 families. The only way to accommodate all of them was by building in height. And they threatened us to go to a hunger strike if we even dare to offer this as a solution, because they could not make the tiny apartments expand. So the conclusion with the families, and this is important, not our conclusion, with the families was that we had a problem. We had to innovate. So what did we do? Well, a middle-class family lives reasonably well in around 80 square meters. But when there's no money, what the market does is to reduce the size of the house to 40 square meters. What we said was, what if, instead of thinking of 40 square meters as a small house, why don't we consider it half of a good one? When you rephrase the problem as half of a good house instead of a small one, the key question is, which half do we do? And we thought we had to do with public money the half that families won't be able to do individually. We identified 5 design conditions that belong to the hard half of a house, and we went back to the families to do 2 things: join forces and split tasks. Our design was something in between a building and a house. As a building, it could pay for expensive, well-located land. And as a house, it could expand. If in the process of not being expelled to the periphery while getting a house, families kept their network and their jobs, we knew that the expansion would begin right away. So we went from this initial social housing to a middle-class unit achieved by families themselves within a couple of weeks. This was our first project in Iquique 10 years ago. This is our last project in Chile. Different designs, same principle. You provide a frame, and from then on, families take over. So, the purpose of design trying to understand and trying to give an answer to the 3S menace, scale, speed, and scarcity, is to channel people's own building capacity. We won't solve the 1 million people per week equation unless we use people's own power for building. So with the right design, slums and favelas may not be the problem, but actually the only possible solution. The second case is how design can...
So, super interesting. Not necessarily the best condition for in a North American cold climate. But the goal in showing you that is kind of just to understand that there are a lot of different options with respect to these projects. And there are lots of solutions when it comes to potential conflicts. Now, this isn't to say that you need to come up with these solutions. You need to say, okay, we're now architects and we're going to build all this stuff. And I have, the solution, because maybe that fits back to the knowing where you're an expert and knowing where you're not. But what it is to say is that this understanding of your architectural narrative that stems from your values, stems from your beliefs and your mandates as an organization and as individuals, is not superfluous. It's not something that gets added in after, because you don't get this after without having this before. So the temptation to go really quickly or to do it on the cheap, it doesn't necessarily have to be a compromising of your values. And I would argue, and kind of the purpose of this whole creating compelling stories is the argument that if it does, you may be running into your own problems later down the line. So keeping people in the center and using that narrative to drive what you want to create is sort of the summary, is the recap of this creating compelling stories. And I hope that it would spark some discussion and some thoughts.